There is a fingerprint your browser produces from a sound it never actually plays. No speaker moves, nothing comes out of your headphones, and yet a website can learn something quietly identifying about your machine in the time it takes a page to load. It is called audio fingerprinting, and it is one of the most overlooked signals in this whole space, precisely because there is nothing to see or hear when it happens. Today I want to explain, defensively and in plain terms, what audio fingerprinting is, how detection reads it, and why the tools that carefully handle the canvas so often leak this one. Quick note on framing before I start. I run real proxy and cloud phone farms, and I test how these browsers handle fingerprinting for a living. So the quiet signals like this one are the layer I spend the most time on. I'm going to keep this third person and defensive the whole way, how the technique works and how it is defended against, not a recipe for beating any particular site. And no undetectable promises anywhere. Understanding this signal removes one more contradiction. It does not make anything invisible. Start with the mechanism, because it is simpler than the name suggests. Modern browsers ship an audio processing system that pages can use to generate and shape sound entirely in software. A fingerprinting script uses it to create a tone, usually with an oscillator runs that tone through a little chain of processing, and then instead of playing it out loud, it reads the resulting numbers straight back out of the buffer. Those numbers get run through a hash into a short string, and that string is the audio fingerprint. The sound is generated, measured, and discarded all silently in a fraction of a second while the page loads. Here is why a sound nobody hears is worth anything. The exact numbers that come out of that processing depend on your specific hardware and software. The CPU, the audio stack in your operating system, and the math libraries doing the floating point calculations underneath. Two machines running the identical instructions produce results that differ in the tiniest decimal places, and those tiny differences are stable and largely characteristic of a device. So a generated tone that never reaches a speaker becomes a quiet, reliable identifier tied to a particular hardware and software combinations. Part of what makes this signal so useful to trackers is that it costs nothing and asks nothing. Generating and reading an audio buffer does not trigger a permission prompt the way a microphone request would, and it produces no sound, so there is no cue at all that it happened. The page just builds the tone, reads the numbers, and moves on. That means audio fingerprinting runs silently on a huge number of sites, invisible from your side and cheap from theirs, which is exactly the combination that makes a signal popular with detections. Now the idea everything else hangs on, and it is the same one that governs the canvas. A real device produces the same audio value every time, reload after reload, day after day. That stability is normal and expected because your hardware and your audio libraries do not change between page loads. Genuine users' audio fingerprints sit still. Hold on to that, because it is exactly the property a careless spoofing strategy breaks, and breaking it is what turns a hidden signal into a visible flag. Tech tools take one of a few approaches to this signal. Some inject a small amount of randomized noise into the audio numbers before a page can read them, so the real hardware value never leaks out. Some spoof a fixed plausible value that stays consistent for that profile, and some try to block or restrict access to the audio system entirely. Each approach trades off differently between hiding the true device and looking like an ordinary one, and the difference between them is where the real-world success or failure lives. The most common approach is also the most misunderstood, and it is per read noise. Every time a page reads the audio buffer, the browser perturbs the numbers slightly, so the true hardware value stays hidden. On paper, that sounds ideal. The problem is what it does to stability. Think about it from the detector's side. If a script reads the audio fingerprint twice on the same page and gets two different values, no real hardware behaves that way. A genuine device is deterministic. The same tone yields the same numbers every time. So a value that shifts between reads is not hidden. It is announcing that something is actively tampering with it. The better behaved approach is a consistent per profile value. The browser picks one plausible audio fingerprint for the profile once and returns that same value every single time, stable across reads and reloads, the way real hardware would. This looks far more natural to a detector because it has the property that matters most. It does not change. The trade-off is that the value has to be believable and has to agree with the rest of the profile, which is harder than just scattering randomness and hoping it holds. The third approach is to refuse or cripple access to the audio system so the page gets nothing usable. This sounds safe but carries its own tell. Very few ordinary users have a browser that cannot produce a normal audio fingerprint. so a visitor whose audio system is missing or clearly disabled is itself unusual. You have traded a unique fingerprint for the smaller but real signal of being one of the rare visitors who blocks this at all. Sometimes that is the right call, often it just relocates the anomaly instead of removing it. Audio never gets read in isolation, and this is the part people miss. A detector can compare the audio fingerprint against the canvas value, the web renderer string, the reported platform, and the rest of the hardware picture. If the audio has been spoofed to look like one kind of machine while the web render string still reports the real GPU, the two disagree, and that contradiction is more damning than either value on its own. A good tool has to keep the whole hardware story consistent, not just quiet the signals people talk about most while leaving this one raw. Modern fingerprinting scripts specifically hunt for the fingerprints of spoofing. They read the audio value more than once and check whether it stays put. They look for the statistical signature that added noise leaves behind, and they cross-reference the audio against every other hardware signal for agreement. The well-known open-source consistency tests do exactly this, and they will happily report when an audio fingerprint has been tampered with clumsily. The naive defenses have known countermeasures now, and detection has moved on to catching the defense itself rather than the device. There is a subtler trap here worth naming. If your audio value is common, it blends in but identifies you less. If it is rare, it identifies you strongly. A noise strategy that produces a wildly unusual value on every load hands you a fingerprint that is both unstable and rare, the worst of both, unique enough to track you within a session and inconsistent enough to look tampered with. The goal is not maximum randomness. It is a plausible, common-looking value that stays put. More entropy is not more safety here. It is usually the opposite. Here is why audio specifically catches careful people. It is the signal the marketing forgets. A tool will advertise its canvas handling, its WebGL handling, its font handling, and quietly do nothing sensible about audio because it is less famous and less demanded. So an operator polishes every signal they have heard of, runs a checker that only looks at the popular ones, and walks away confident while the audio fingerprint underneath is leaking the real hardware or, worse, leaking obvious noise. The forgotten signal is the one that survives your audit and sinks you later. There is a mistake that quietly undoes everything, and it is the mirror of the noise problem. If a tool hands every one of your profiles the identical spoofed audio value, then all of those profiles now share one fingerprint at the audio layer. You built separate profiles precisely so they would not link, and a shared audio value relinks them anyway, no matter how different their cookies or their proxies are. A good implementation gives each profile its own distinct but stable and plausible value, so the profiles match neither the real hardware nor each other. Sameness across your own profiles is just as dangerous as instability within one. MoveOwl complicates this the way it complicates everything. A real phone processes that generated tone through a different audio stack than a desktop does, so a profile claiming to be a phone should produce an audio fingerprint consistent with that kind of device, not a desktop one. A value that says phone at the page level while the audio underneath looks like a desktop machine is the same contradiction wearing mobile clothing. Believable mobile emulation has to reach down to this quiet signal too, which is one more reason genuine mobile profiles are harder to produce than swapping a handful of reported values. And like every signal, this one drifts. A browser update shifts how the underlying audio processing behaves. A detector updates its checks to catch the current generation of noise, or the spoofing method simply falls behind. An audio setup that tested clean 3 months ago can start leaking without you touching a thing. And because none of it is visible from your side, it is easy to keep trusting a profile long after the ground moved under it. This is why audio, like the canvas, is not a one-time setup step. It is something worth rechecking, especially right after any browser or tool update lands. The practical audit is short and worth doing before you trust a profile. Load a public audio fingerprint test twice and confirm the value is identical both times, not shifting between reads. Check that the audio story agrees with the reported canvas, WebGL, and platform, so the whole hardware picture points at one consistent machine. And confirm the value is not so exotic that it is unique on its own. Stable, consistent, and not bizarre. Those 3 questions are the same ones a real detector is asking, and running them yourself catches the great majority of audio problems a careless setting would create. Be clear about what getting this right does and does not buy you. A consistent, plausible audio fingerprint removes a specific and often overlooked contradiction, and it closes a gap that a lot of tools genuinely leave open. It does not address your behavior, your account history, or how detection shifts over time. and it does not make anything undetectable. It's one more layer made consistent, one more contradiction removed from the pile. That is real value, because it is a signal most people never check, but it is a piece of the picture, not the whole of it. So the honest takeaway is that audio fingerprinting is the quiet cousin of the canvas, a sound your browser never plays that still describes your hardware, and the tools that ace the famous signals so often leave this one raw. The defense is the same discipline as everywhere else, a value that is stable, plausible, common-looking, and consistent with the rest of the profile checked by you rather than assumed. Which browsers actually handle audio properly under testing and which ones leak it is written up hands-on with no undetectable promises anywhere in the full written reviews and tested pics at antidetectbrowser.org. If this cleared up a signal you had never thought to check, subscribe, because there is more coming on the quiet layers underneath the ones everybody talks about. See you in the next one.